Well, let me thank everyone for coming together today to discover Brigham. It's really our pleasure to participate in this session today. My name is Barbara Beer. I'm a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and the Brigham and Women's Hospital, and part of the Division of Global Health Equity in the Department of Medicine. Fasola?
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining today. I'm an infectious disease physician in the Division of Global Health Equity and the Infectious Disease Division at the Brigham.
Thank you. And today we're going to be talking about committing to diversity, inclusion, and equity in clinical research. The time is now. We're first going to be each of us giving a short introduction to the work and what we see as some of the issues, and then having a time for an open discussion. And then we'll be moving to a networking session so that we can have a further conversation about these issues. So I'm going to first describe some of the work that the Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center has done, and then Fasola will continue to talk about her work, and then we'll have a discussion. So I'm the faculty director of the Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center, the MRCT Center, which is really a research and policy center at the Brigham and Harvard dedicated to the integrity, rigor, and safety of global clinical trials, and specifically the ethics, conduct, and regulatory environment of multi-site, multinational clinical trials. And we do the work by pulling together diverse stakeholders, pharma, academia, CROs, patient advocates, regulatory folks, to really think about the issues that we're seeing and then to think about how to solve for those issues, thinking that with everyone together at the table, what we come up with as approaches will be far more successful than if we did that independently. So today we're going to talk about inclusion in clinical research, and I don't have to remind you all of how clearly demonstrated this has been, the disparity and health disparities in the COVID-19 era with Black, Latino, Indigenous, and other marginalized populations, both bearing the burden of the incidence of disease, but even adjusted for race, for age, seeing the increased mortality. And despite that, these populations are underrepresented in research. There have been 2 vaccine trials that have appropriately included diverse populations, but in general, this has been a significant problem in the work that has gone on over the last year. Importantly, however, this is not a new problem. When we think of the first sort of comprehensive analysis, and there have been many, many publications about this, but the FDA publishes the number of patients in pivotal clinical trials, that is the phase 3 trials that are leading to the approval, review and approval of drugs and products. Dating back 3 years ago, or now 5 years ago, the proportion of Black and African American is one example of patients in therapeutic areas such as cardiovascular disease and oncology was less than 3%. And that is despite knowing that the incidence and severity of these diseases are felt more and more greatly in those populations. Of course, what was informative then was that if you look at psychiatry, fully 24% of patients are Black and African American. Now, whether that's because of an intentional outreach to those populations or because there is stigma and a way of enrolling in a clinical trial, what's behind that data, we don't know, but this is the data that prompted the MRCT Center to begin a real effort on diversity and inclusion. Now, what we know are that clinical trials obviously are necessary to develop new treatments and vaccines, And if you look at this from a theoretical point of view, the people in the trials should really reflect the population either affected by the disease or those intended to use the intervention. And as I said, underrepresentation of race and ethnicity, as well as women and individuals at either end of the age spectrum, young and very old, is not new. It's true in both industry and academic trials, and it's across therapeutic areas. And importantly, while you could argue that the point of clinical research is to understand heterogeneous treatment effect and biology, it's also a question of health equity, fairness, and public trust, as we've seen. So we took a broad definition of diversity and looked at many dimensions of diversity. Race and ethnicity, which we'll talk about today, principally is true, as well as many of the other issues of exclusion from clinical trials. And we also have to appreciate that people don't fit into one bucket. They're not Black or they're not women, they are Black women. And there are interactions between and among those dimensions of diversity that are very, very important to reflect upon and to think through for appropriate inclusion and consideration, including things like how do people get their information? Who do they trust? Who do they turn to? So that resulted in, as I said, 3 years of work, and we've now made this guidance and toolkit available. It's on our website and free to download. And I'm just going to take you through some of the high-level thoughts here about that work, but I can't possibly do justice to it. It is a long document, fairly turgid, but I also hope fairly complete. And the first thing to say is that, and I know Basila will be talking about this in greater detail, that we identified many barriers, and those barriers to diverse inclusion as represented either by conversation or by through the literature, really are barriers felt by every group in the clinical trial enterprise. There are issues for the sponsors, sites, regulators, institutions, for the referring staff, for investigators, for the study teams. There are issues with data collection and the completeness of that data collection and interoperability of the data. And then there are significant issues with the patient's advocates, including things like, are they offered clinical trials? Are they aware of them? Has the study design been minimized to really think about what's important to them? And have we tried to get rid of the burdens? Are the outcomes of uncertain benefit to those populations? Have we thought about the logistics of trial conduct? And then this very important issue of mistrust. And when we think about sponsors, investigators, there's now, I hope, a change in pattern, but a lack of engagement. There's a diversity of the workforce, travel time and cost, and variable regulatory expectations. So with that, we realized that if you don't ask people, they cannot be part of the clinical trial. And if you look at the data, at least in oncology and several other places, individuals that are asked have the same, of Black and brown participants, have the same rate of saying yes and the same rate of completion as everyone else. So what can we do? So if you look at a typical trial journey such as this, where patients come in, they're aware of it, they need to be recruited and screened. There are many interventions that we can do, starting with the importance of community engagement, health literacy, and a good feasibility assessment. If you then look at study conduct, again, many, many things we could do in terms of study design, logistical issues, taking care of that, transportation payment, decentralizing the trials as we can, making sure we return results to the participants and the community, and then of course, end of data and analysis and thinking through those issues. But importantly, this starts with engaging the community, thinking about how we respectfully hear from and do trustworthy outreach to the community. And importantly, that whatever we do ends up improving the health of those communities and thinking about how we can make this a better process for folks. Those need to be real and respectful partnerships. They can't be outreach without thinking about them, and they have to have real and measurable benefits to the community. Everyone has a role to play, and everyone is accountable. And I think that we need to cooperatively develop metrics, transparency about those metrics, and comfort in talking with each other about how to do a better job. How can we hold ourselves and each other accountable, realizing that this is a change that is going to take more than a moment in time, more than a realization, but rather a real commitment over the long term to change where we are in clinical research and thereby change health equity for all. Now, I know I've flown through a lot of that, but I wanted to make sure that we had time for Vasola and conversation afterwards. Vasola?
Great. Thank you, Barbara. I'm also, in addition to being an infectious disease physician, I'm the faculty director for the Community Engaged Research Program within the Harvard Center for AIDS Research. And much of the work that I do focuses in on some of the concepts that Barbara just emphasized. This idea of community engagement and developing collaborative partnerships, that's really a core component of the work that I do. So building on her presentation, I'd like to share some general thoughts, some really broad-based solutions to some of the challenges that I know we all recognize and realize exist to increasing diversity and equity in clinical research. And then, I hope there's time for us to dig into more specific strategies and kind of get a better sense of what's practical in terms of the work that we all do. Next slide. So as mentioned, I work with the Harvard CFAR, and it's basically a large NIH grant funded at 17 different sites across the country that provides research support to do collaborative, innovative, multidisciplinary research that is all sort of geared towards ending the HIV epidemic, both domestically and internationally. And the Community Engaged Research Program that I mentioned, basically, our underlying sort of goal is to increase recruitment and retention, particularly of diverse individuals. But in a broader sense, our goal is to develop these sustainable collaborations, with community partners, specifically within communities at highest risk for HIV, both in Massachusetts and nationally. So we're talking about organizations that serve Black and Latinx individuals who are disproportionately impacted by HIV, LGBT advocacy groups, organizations that address the needs of individuals with substance use disorder, as well as organizations that are serving the needs of people who are living with HIV. And through these collaborations, I think the bigger piece is that, yes, of course, we would like to increase recruitment and retention, but what we're really trying to do is increase research and health literacy, disseminate research findings that may not reach, communities to a broader sort of a network of individuals. And we also want to identify the questions that really matter to the community and hopefully engage them in research that addresses those questions. And I think for me, what I've really been emphasizing through some of the work is to focus on the sense of authentic collaboration in the research process. So there's really, sort of a co-ownership of what it is we're doing, because without that, very little can change unless people really feel like they're part of the process. Next slide. So keeping those goals in mind, I think Barbara made a very strong case for why diversity in clinical research is important. I want to add two things that I think we don't always think about as we think about recruiting and diversifying our participants in clinical research. It's particularly important that we do this increasing of health and research literacy. And the reason why that's so important is because really what we're talking about is diffusion of innovation. we have so many interventions. We have therapeutics that we want to talk about, with COVID-19, certainly therapeutics as well as the vaccine. And these ideas, these thoughts, they don't always get into marginalized communities. They don't have the information. They don't necessarily have access to a lot of that. And part of what we hope to do, and part of what's been actually seen in some studies, has been that when one person participates in a clinical trial, they describe their experience to another, and so on and so on. And that's how ideas and innovation gain momentum. The hope being that new innovation, new interventions are eventually adopted based on some of the experiences of folks who've had access to information. And so I think sometimes we don't always think about clinical trials or clinical research in that way, that it's not just about the participant, it's about their social network. In addition, increasing diversity in clinical trials may also increase confidence in the intervention. I mean, certainly, again, I'll refer back to COVID-19 vaccine research. One of the thoughts and one of the concerns that everybody had was that if we don't have diversity in clinical trials, then people are not going to feel like people like them, were part of the process, but also that the safety and efficacy issues were tested in people who are like them. And hopefully, if they feel that sense of commonality, if they see the results, if they see the data, if it's disseminated to them, they might feel more comfortable with the intervention, in this case, COVID-19 vaccines. Next slide. So with that in mind, as Barbara already stated, there are many different barriers to clinical trial participation. There's certainly their patient level, research level, systems level, other levels. There are many that are very, or could probably more easily be rectified, and some that are broader. So I actually want to focus in on one specific barrier, largely because I believe that it's a challenge that is more difficult to overcome, that people are very challenged by and aren't really sure what to deal with, and that barrier is mistrust. And I want to emphasize, though, that this is one potential barrier to engagement in clinical research. There are certainly studies, pre-COVID studies, demonstrating that Black and Latinx individuals are no less willing to participate in research based on attitudinal beliefs. But we know that it's there. And certainly we also know, based on studies that a number of teams have now published, we recently finished a study that's now in press, showing just the high level of mistrust around COVID-19, particularly within Black and Latinx communities. And so what does that mean for us? What is there that's happening that may be heightened, particularly in this era of COVID-19? Next slide. So we all in general know what mistrust is, but I think it's always good to put a definition behind things. And essentially, it's the absence of the belief in the fact that researchers, healthcare providers, and institutions genuinely care about you, people who look like you, or people who are in your community. So it's just that sense that people don't really care so much about you. And unfortunately, that as I mentioned, can be quite deeply rooted, and it can serve as a barrier. It's also not believing that those entities, whether they be healthcare systems, research institutions, providers, researchers, are really honest or transparent. And I think that's a big piece of what people feel now in terms of the misinformation that's out there, and questions about what it is we know versus what it is that we should know about different aspects of COVID-19. And unfortunately, like I said, mistrust is common within some communities, particularly communities of color, and it may inhibit engagement in research. It may inhibit the uptake of interventions, and it's certainly been identified as a root cause of racial and ethnic disparities beyond COVID-19. Next slide. So why is mistrust so deeply rooted and difficult to overcome when we talk about trying to promote equity? Well, I think that everybody should be aware that there's a long history of mistreatment and misconduct in the name of research and medical experimentation that people of color in this country have experienced and beyond. And certainly this long history is important. And if you look at the pictures on the left side of your slide, I'm sure you can probably identify or get a sense of what I'm certainly referring to in terms of these very egregious sort of events. But I also think that it's important, and it's something that we need to continue to think about, is that this issue of mistrust is really a result of ongoing systemic inequity, ongoing structural racism within the healthcare system and well beyond the healthcare system, such as you know, if you're just talking about healthcare system, limited access to high quality healthcare, longer wait times in the emergency room and for specialty care, more illness, worse outcomes, premature death, all within, communities of color, all disproportionately impacting certain groups of individuals, and all of it being promoted by discrimination, ongoing racism, and anti-immigrant sentiment. Next slide. So what do we do about this? Well, again, I wanted to emphasize that what I wanted to start the discussion with a sort of broad-based thinking about this. And Barbara mentioned about, you know, the importance of community engagement. And many people have thought about ways to mitigate mistrust in that regard on sort of the community level. So mitigating the mistrust between individuals and researchers, individuals and healthcare providers, and the broader community and, you know, academic institutions, including ours. I think that in order to really shift the current dynamic of mistrust, we need to sort of step back and maybe re-examine our interactions with our surrounding communities, particularly communities of color where mistrust is quite prevalent. And in regards to research recruitment, I think that one of the things that, you know, we often do, and inherently there's nothing wrong with it, is really community outreach. Okay, so that's where we reach out to stakeholders and, you know, groups within communities to provide information, education. It's something that's temporary, it's time limited, it's unidirectional. It's about us getting something accomplished. That it could be something accomplished that's very important for that community, whatever, but it is sort of one-sided in that sense. In the middle of a pandemic, I mean, you have needs. Community outreach is expedient. So again, there's nothing wrong with it. It has its place. But as you think about the ways in which we should be mitigating mistrust, it really means we have to go deeper than that. So community engagement, again, a lot of people have thought about it. A lot of people have been doing this. It's a longer term process. It involves working collaboratively with groups of people to understand their issues and then to address those issues. Shared goals, common agenda, all that sort of part of community engagement. But I think one of the issues with community engagement in general, is I've done a lot of community engage research, is that it doesn't always lead to papers and, you know, grants necessarily, but this is what builds the foundation, and it takes time. This is what builds the foundation that will eventually lead to better relationships and more opportunities in terms of recruitment and diversifying and doing all the things that we want to do in terms of equity. So, but beyond community engagement, essentially community engagement 2.0, I call it community investment. And basically that involves establishing actual real partnerships between communities, academia, government, industry, if they're involved at all in the research. And I think it really is about building upon assets within each entity and in sort of ensuring there's this mutual bidirectional benefit that actually supports community needs and challenges that may be beyond research. They may not necessarily directly be about research. And I think the point in here of using that term investment is to emphasize that the community, the very marginalized community that's, you know, lost a lot of capacity, probably maybe in some cases never had capacity to do a lot of things, should reap some benefit from the relationship, benefit beyond, you know, sort of, you know, whatever small amounts of money one may, you know, offer in terms of, you know, recruiting participants or something of that nature. So really reap some benefit. And I'll give you some examples. Next slide. But let me turn to the overall example of COVID-19 vaccine research for a moment. You know, as we know, there's been enormous financial investment, there's been enormous research investment, and everybody is extremely worried about the fact that, you know, we may not have people who are going to actually take the vaccine. So then the question is, next slide, could we have done something differently? Should we be doing something going forward, be different? And that's community engagement and investment. And I think that needs to happen. It needs to happen more quickly. A lot of people are very concerned that it's happening very slowly, and there really hasn't been a building of a foundation of vaccine confidence, particularly within communities of color. Next slide. So I know we want to have time to talk, and I think we don't have that much time left, but these are just some ideas in terms of community investment. These are things that people have thought about, investing in community-based organizations. So therefore, that means basically, you know, providing, or example would be offering in-kind resources to actually build capacity within community-based organizations, serving people of color, serving people in the communities that you want to partner with. Next slide. And I'll just mention that a lot of the work that we did with the CFAR very early in the epidemic in the pandemic was to offer opportunities for people to just talk, support and offer opportunities that really had nothing directly to do with research. So we were supporting the needs within the community without necessarily, doing recruitment or focusing in on research issues. Next slide. And then lastly, I just want to mention that there's a conference coming up on January 14th that will be looking at some of these challenges, particularly recruiting for trials that are related to HIV within COVID-19. But certainly, I think that the ideas that will be proposed there will be applicable to lots of different disciplines. And I'll stop there.
Well, thank you so much. I know we only have a few minutes left, and I'll see if there are any questions coming in. But let me start while we're seeing that. And parenthetically, we're happy to continue this discussion in the networking session. What do you think the Brigham can do to really make this real? And I worry about 100 faculty reaching out to the same surrounding community and now overwhelmed with, sort of one-off requests. So how are you thinking about that?
Right. So I think there are a number of things. I think what you're saying is absolutely important. People are tired. There's sort of outreach fatigue that's occurring within communities. I think that there needs to be more of a systematic way to connect with key stakeholders, particularly in light of what we're dealing with COVID-19. This is not going to stop. The studies are going to be ongoing. There are a few of us who've served as gatekeepers in a sense. I don't necessarily like that term, but it is what we're approached for, to find out where people should go recruit, who they should talk to. There needs to be a more systematic way of doing this, and I know we've talked to the Catalyst about this and they're working on some things. So I see some momentum in that area. So there'd be a systematic approach. One of the other things I think is important that's been mentioned in regards to access to research, maybe as an institution, there needs to be a strategy to support the presence of recruitment staff, people who know about research, who can talk to people who are sort of ambassadors for research at some of our community health centers who are just regularly there, or at some of the community-based organizations that many of us work with, and who are racially and ethnically concordant with a lot of that, with the populations who are served there. Just the idea that it's there, it's in your community. This is something that's part and parcel to what we see on a regular basis. And then just the last real quick piece is that I really think there needs to be a better way to do some diversity in terms of recruitment of research assistants. I currently have a couple of positions that are open, and I it feels like it's happenstance, and who's coming, who's being referred to me. There needs to be some way of doing that in a more sort of structured sense. But thanks, Barbara, for asking me that question.
And let me just say that I think our community health outreach group is really working on that. I think that Yale Center for Clinical Investigation has a very strong ambassador program that we could model. I think that there's a real role for, as you say, there are patient navigators. We should have participant navigators. We should understand what it would take for people to participate. How do we understand their concerns and issues? How do we make our materials health literate and responsive? How do we, importantly, engage the communities and potential partners and participants in advance of even thinking about the specific trial? As we think about the program, as we think about getting that, because if you, early in the process, because if you do that at the time of, how do I now recruit, it's already almost too late. They should have been part of that process from conceptualization. So let me just say, I don't know that any questions have come in through the chat, but both Basila and I are hopeful that you'll come to the networking session and we'll have a chance to talk together about how we can be stronger in our commitment to do this work right. And I think that there are probably, so many different efforts, including things like providing mentoring opportunities, providing training opportunities, and then thinking through our conduct of clinical trials, and then how we're going to organize together to do a better job of community partnership. So let me close here. Thank you so much, Vasola. And
Thank you.
we're going to see you all, hopefully, in the networking session to follow. Thank you.